right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to what's the fifth in our series of lectures on strategic gaming. I'm very pleased to say that our speaker today is a colleague of mine here at the Center for Applied Strategic Learning at the National Defense University, Ms. Deirdre Hollingshed, who's been with the Center for many years. And we're really excited to have her speak on alternative perspectives in gaming today. So with that, Deirdre, would you like to take it away?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ellie. I appreciate this opportunity, and hopefully this will be beneficial to everyone who's listening. First, a little bit about me. As Ellie mentioned, I have been here what feels like longer than probably about the sum of the 6 years that I've been coming here to work, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how long I've been at this. We now do primarily educational games. I have done policy games in the past, so a lot of the language that you'll hear today is geared towards educational games, and where I have noted a difference in an approach towards a policy game, I will make that differentiation. I also want to say that I don't have a gaming background, or at least did not. My background is in interagency work and kind of government relations and policy work itself, and I think that is reflected in my approach to how I've decided to put today's talk together and how I kind of come at this job. And I offer you that as, I guess, the first of several caveats, to which I would like to issue a blanket caveat for this talk, saying that it is not my intent to offend anyone or say anything untoward, but I find that when you're talking about the types of things that we're talking about, that's very easy to do. So please accept my apology in advance. I also want to say that I talk today not to present a formal recipe for how to include better perspectives, but how to include additional perspectives, but I offer suggestions on kind of how I've done it, what's worked, what hasn't, and kind of notes from the road that I've walked on for this 6 years. As I mentioned earlier, I walked this road at least for the next hour with a slight bit of fear, because this can get into some complicated stuff. At least in the exercises that I've done, it can get into complicated stuff as you are representing groups of people, organizations, nations, and that sort of thing. And it can get into complicated stuff in the preparation as well as the execution, because you have to figure out to what extent you can talk to the client about how you're going to do this and what you're going to do. And those conversations don't always go well. They can be challenging because at the very least, you can present a vision of a group of people or a nation or an entity that differs from what they have of the vision that they have of themselves, and a vision that differs from their own narrative, and that can be tricky. You'll notice that notes did not, or sources did not necessarily accompany these slides. It's not that I proceed, as Anais Nin would say, without fear and without research. It's just that I wanted to get the sense of what was going to resonate with the group and produce sources and notes that would augment this conversation. So we hope to make those available in the middle of next week. It may very well be that product may very well be a victim of our sequestration/furlough schedule, so I offer that out now. With that having been said, I would like to move straight into our conversation, so I invite everyone to flip to slide 2. All right. Basically, what we're going to talk about today is, as I mentioned, I wanted to give you this slide gives you an overview of the talk ahead. We will talk about kind of alternative perspectives, working definitions and observations. As I've learned, words matter. We will go through some why slides, the inevitable why slides, because I find that if you incorporate those in and don't draw particular attention to those, people always have questions anyway, so I just label them the why slides, and hopefully people will have a firm understanding of why we're doing this after we complete the slides or after we complete the talk. We'll move into some key concepts that I have found are kind of germane to every exercise I've done, as well as some opportunities presented for that encourage inclusion and challenges that can present barriers to including alternative perspectives. And then we'll talk a little bit about the practical applications of that and where to put that in exercises, as well as and by in exercises I mean in the preparation and the execution of exercises, specifically products, people, and methods. So I invite you to turn to the next slide, where, as I said, we'll talk about a working definition, key observations, a look at how the traditional voices and perspectives used to look, and by that I mean the traditional voices and perspectives at the table in games past, or at least games past that I've observed, and the newer voices and perspectives that are coming to the table, as well as need to be, to my thinking, included into our exercises. And then we will move into the first why slide. So next slide, please. We should be on slide 4. I offer this working definition of alternative perspectives, which I see as thoughts, motivations, aspirations, and intentions of individuals, actors, entities, and groups kind of in a scenario. That's a very loose definition because I am a very kind of fluid, flexible person, and I didn't necessarily want to use words like underrepresented or misrepresented, even though that's the term I mean, because these perspectives can be found anywhere. They can be found as people who aren't necessarily at the table, as well as people who are at the perspectives of people who are at the table but don't necessarily speak up. My research colleagues, those trained in research, often call that the dog that didn't bark. And the way that I've seen that manifest itself most closely in the exercises that I've done in a military environment will be the idea that if you have a bunch of military people in a room and you have senior officers in the room, junior officers will not say anything that will contradict senior officers. So I offer that as an example of a working definition or an alternative perspective that I believe, if properly included, enhances and should inform the educational products and can enrich the discussions as well as the environment in which we practice this craft. So you'll notice in key observations, I often find that these perspectives, when combined with other factors such as resources and culture, are often directly responsible for human behavior. Thus, I found it a bit curious when I was when I became interested in this a couple of years ago, that within games as well as kind of within international relations, you have to kind of move through several academic disciplines as well as several sources to kind of piece together how best to do this. So as I had alluded to earlier, these perspectives are found on they can be found anywhere. They can be found on any and all teams, and they are often underrepresented. And as I keep saying, some of these perspectives accompany unpleasant/sensitive issues. And it's been my experience that if you are talking about something that you wouldn't normally bring up at a water cooler in whatever country you happen to be gaming, or whatever group of people you happen to be discussing, if you wouldn't bring it up amongst them, that's probably the very issue that needs to be most faithfully represented in the exercise, because it's been my experience that particular issue, that particular event is often the thing that it represents a significant driver of human behavior. So next slide, please. An additional observation. I have found, I love this phrase that I understand has been attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan: you are entitled to your own opinion but not your own facts. I think that we are seeing an explosion of facts, as various media outlets will attest to. Everyone seems to have their own expert and their own way of looking at the world. And on the one hand, I understand why that can get problematic, but then on the other hand, I appreciate the fact that there are different sets of facts out there, and these alternative perspectives, it's been my experience, often do come with their own facts. And their facts are such that they aren't necessarily of interest to the dominant group, and a lot of times can represent challenging thoughts and ideas to people who are, when presented with them. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these facts can be the dog that didn't bark, or the people that have them can be the dog that didn't bark. So I think it's interesting. I really appreciate watching at least Western society try to grapple with the idea that everyone's got their own facts now, everyone's got their own worldview, and more importantly, everyone's got platforms to put those out into the universe. So I think that exercises are enhanced by mirroring that. So I just offered that observation because it is something that I think people grapple with every day. And I hear people talk about the fact that as people long for kind of a simpler time, what they're usually saying is they usually long for a time when there wasn't so much information out there of which they had to feel they had to keep up with and or respect and understand. So next slide, please. Okay, on the next slide, I offer, I guess, what have kind of traditionally been the voices at the table with respect to exercises. This is, I guess, the big four when it came to national security and when it came to who you had to have at the table. And the next slide, which should be slide 7, I offer some of the actors. I will not be so arrogant as to assume that I've included all of them, but these are just some of the voices that are demanding to be heard, and some of the perspectives that are better, when included, are better represented and offer us an opportunity to create better experiential learning products as well as to produce better policy outcomes. Next slide, please. And we've hit the first why slide. The why slides, I hope that after we've reviewed these, I hope you have a better understanding of why this stuff needs to be here, basically. And in answering that question, I offer a historical explanation. I offer words from someone above me on the org chart in the Department of Defense, and I offer some practical answers as well. And I guess from an educational perspective, I guess with the practicality of it, of which the one thing I will say is that I think this sort of thing is important, and you will see that in the slides coming up, because if not done correctly, I almost get the sense that we are, at least in the educational realm, preparing people to make decisions in a world that doesn't exist if we oversimplify and don't include these sorts of perspectives. So that having been said, please move to the next slide. And you'll notice that, or at least I've best heard it explained, that in the past, conflict as well as battle space was about controlling territory, and it was about geography. Thus, I include the map. And it made things relatively simple because it pointed towards a universal understanding of how things should be done. And by that I mean if you understood the terrain and you had a good sense of resources and you had a good sense of your adversary's resources, it was pretty good indicator of what they were going to do. I recognize that's a gross oversimplification, but I want to use that in a way to contrast the environment that we are working in now, which I see as infinitely more complex because you are trying to control that using, please advance to slide 10. The methods that I have indicated on slide 10, the more traditional ways of controlling territory. But now, if you advance to slide 11, we have different things that we need to, in different ways in which we need to engage. We are controlling territory as well as controlling different spaces. This can be done in print, which has always been the case. This can be done using technology. Geography is represented as well. And if you'll advance to the next slide. We are also looking to control the space in between people's ears. This one, to my thinking, is a bit more complex because you are working with the limbic system, which is that I've almost heard it oversimplified as that reptilian part of your brain that speaks to, at some fundamental level, emotions, which you cannot guide, which are at best can be interpreted once they appear in someone's mind. So to my thinking, this is a little bit harder because you don't necessarily know when you're doing a good job. You usually find out you're not doing a good job after the bang or after the boom, as people say. Next slide. And as I mentioned, I've pulled a quote from someone way far up the organizational chart within the Department of Defense. The language comes from a joint education white paper that General Dempsey put together, and I believe the quote here pretty much captures why we do what we do here at National Defense University and why this is so important to put into educational games. Next slide, please. In summation, I believe that the why of this issue is that these alternative perspectives will allow us, if we can represent them with fidelity, to better reflect the strategic and operational environs in which our exercise participants will find themselves. It will improve the quality of our products and our services. And it will improve the experience of exercise participants, although a word on that later. They might not necessarily think so at the time. And it offers participants a chance to understand the intangibles, the human factors, etc., of strategy and policy. I have found that this also mirrors, or this also is true in policy exercises as well, in that all of these points, the benefits for educational exercises also mirror those of policy exercises, even to the point of number 3, which, as I mentioned, is to improve the experience of exercise participants. And this gets into that loaded question of what constitutes a good exercise. I'm not going to dance in that minefield right now. I might set foot in that field in a few slides. So next slide, please. Next, I'd like to move into some core concepts that I have come at as I have tried to do this. Want to talk about where to find tools to do this, a bit more about how to do this, and I offer some additional concepts and then conclude with the concept of, I guess I like to call red flags and bowls. And so hopefully we can move through this, I guess, relatively quickly and get to the questions of which I am genuinely interested. So that having been said, next slide. The core concepts that I find are very, very important when including alternative perspectives in an exercise are to get at the culture of whatever group you're trying to represent. If there is, I'm not going to be so arrogant to suggest that there is a narrative, but if you can get the sense of as many of the competing narratives that exist out there and what events exist and inform that particular perspective through memory. What, to my thinking, the memory question is, what do they think happened? What events are key? I like to think of narrative as picking up larger themes within a person or a group's historical past, and memory dealing with kind of particular events, as well as how those events kind of string together. That reaches into narrative, but these are very kind of squishy definitions, which make them a challenge, but still make them important. Next slide, please. When it comes to culture, I have found that if you are not lucky enough to have an anthropologist nearby, and you are lucky enough to have a very big library and very patient and helpful librarians, you come very quickly to the, if you do your own research, you come very quickly to Gert Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, and I find that this is a window into thinking about how Americans or Westerners view culture versus how non-Westerners view culture, and it also offers a way to think about who is sitting at the table, who is creating the exercise, and who is going to be facilitating the exercise, and what the outcomes of the exercise will be, how to think about those products, and how those products will be shaped by a couple of key points that we have listed on on slide 17. There are, as anthropology has several buildings dedicated to it and several volumes on library shelves, several books written about this. There are more anthropological concepts as well as social psychology concepts, but I find that these 5 will at least get you down the right road. And these 5 also tend to be the ways in which Westerners and particularly Americans are the most different from other people. A big one, and these aren't necessarily listed in particular order. I will go through these via sentence, but if you Google these, you can go online and figure out where the United States is in these sorts of things, as well as where various countries are. They even have various websites where you can put your country in and put 2 countries in, and it will spit out some kind of language about how interactions will go between a particular person or particular countries based on these sorts of cultural dimensions. I say this with the caveat that this in no way, visiting these sites in no way constitutes completion. One thing that I hope that has come through in this conversation is that when trying to put these perspectives in, it is not a series of boxes to be checked. So that having been said, we will move straight into the big 5. Uncertainty avoidance, I find, is huge. The R word, and by that I mean risk, comes in here, and how comfortable people are with risk. Speaks to how they're going to achieve what they're going to achieve. So that is a way they're going to do something, and they're also going to think about how, in their own minds, how they're going to do something. It is, I find, always very interesting because it looks to how willing you are to embrace change, how willing you are to move out in uncertainty, as well as at the individual level in exercises, and I've noticed this a lot in facilitating, where you are, where your anxiety comes. Does it come in before a decision is made? Does it come after a decision is made? And these sorts of things manifest themselves as well in organizational cultures also. And by that I mean specific government agencies. I mean for-profit versus non-profit business environments. One of the ways in which that this is, I think, plays out in a way that everybody can understand is when they were talking about the recent the role of bankers versus investors in the economic I don't want to say collapse, but the economic turbulence that we experienced a couple of years ago, from which I guess the world is still trying to crawl out of. Bankers love certainty. They are almost allergic to uncertainty. They don't have a tolerance for risk. Investors, by their very nature, have a very strong tolerance for risk. They actually take jobs that encourage that. And it is the blending of those 2 cultures, and it is the blending specifically of office responsibilities and who should be in charge of what, that a lot of government officials were looking at and a lot of people were talking about when they were considering, how do we get into this jam? How were people allowed to create these mortgages? How were business practices allowed to happen? Who was in charge of what? That's just one example of the way this sort of thing can manifest itself. The way that I've seen it manifest itself in exercise facilitation is if you have a lot of really strong drivers, and by that I mean people who are, I call them productivity bunnies, people who really, really, really like to get things done, they are going to scoff the longer the strategic portion of any exercise goes on. If you can move into policy, what you're going to do, if you can move the conversation past the strategic issues, they tend to feel more comfortable there. Another one of the big five that I find is huge, and I see this play out in exercises all the time, is the linear versus nonlinear thinking. And that is basically most Westerners tend to be linear thinkers. It really speaks to how you work. It speaks to what your environment looks like. It speaks to how you plan your day. It speaks to how you live your life and how you expect things to happen. Linear thinkers tend to, as it says, obviously think in a linear way, and this manifests itself throughout all aspects of exercise preparation, as well as exercise facilitation, as well as exercise execution. The challenge here can be is that linear thinkers, when they put exercises together, assume that everyone else is a linear thinker also. And what they want to do is they assume that linear thinkers are going to want to move straight into something. They're going to want to figure out exactly what needs to be done. They like to operate in what they believe is called kind of a universal language. They speak with facts, not that there's anything wrong with that, but this can be a challenge because they will assign motivations, and they will assume that other people work the way that they do, want what they want. It has been my experience that if there's going to be hand waving that's going to occur in an exercise, it is going to occur when it surrounds this sort of thinking. The rest of the world, or good portions of the rest of the world, appear to be nonlinear thinkers, hence the term you have to sit down and drink the tea. You have to develop the relationship. You don't just go straight in and figure out what you want to do. Another piece that's just huge in correctly or better representing perspectives is the concept of the individual versus the collective, and this is basically how willing a person is to strike out on their own. It's one of the harder things to understand because it ties in very closely with the one I have listed below it. More on that in a minute.
Tomorrow.
So it goes to the whether or not an individual is expected to transcend their environment or whether or not an individual is expected to blend in. This is also, when you do a lot of cross-cultural work, this is also represented in what people expect out of life, how people are supposed to navigate their lives. Westerners have a saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And what I find is that saying is an indicator that individual behavior, differentiating yourself, is rewarded. Fortune favors the bold. A lot of older societies don't necessarily think that way or don't necessarily behave that way. And there's an Asian saying that the nail that sticks out gets pounded in. So I have found that the individualistic nature of Western society can be very problematic in that a lot of people, when they create games or when they represent others in games, will assume that there will be this individual behavior, or that behavior will groups of people will act the same way that they would. They wouldn't necessarily wait and move within a collective. Americans aren't necessarily as consumed with, and this is obviously, there are regional differences here, your lineage, your name, and by your name I mean your last name. So that is a way that can manifest itself, and that is a way that I found that Western game writers can misrepresent the rewards and the interest and motivations of other entities. As I mentioned, the fourth one is particularly tricky because it speaks to kind of roles in society, and it speaks to the differentiation of roles for people in society and what people are expected to do. A lot of masculine societies have different rules for men and women, and less so for feminine cultures. A lot of masculine cultures tend to be very individualistic in that it is good for the individual to strike out on their own. This sort of thing is also manifested, I have found, in in Western societies, particularly in U.S. society. This will manifest itself in class issues. Whereas there is loyalty in feminine aspects of Western society, there is loyalty to a particular piece of geography. You are from this neighborhood. You are from that particular section of town. Therefore, you do not leave. You will grow up and remain there for the better part of life, whereas a more masculine outlook, a more individualistic outlook will strike out and move to the other side of town, move to the other side of the country in pursuit of a job or something like that. That is also something that is changing as well, in that as economics plays a huge role in this, one of the I guess what I want to say is one of the contributing factors to the masculine as well as the individual advancement or characteristics of Western society has been the wealth that people have had, whereas in collective and feminine societies you cannot break out. You cannot break away because that is seen as your connection to the collective is assures your receiving of certain benefits and assures your receiving of being plugged into various power structures. And that is something that not understanding that can really get you in trouble very quickly, because you can misunderstand how someone's going to go about something, how someone is going to approach something. A person from a individual or heavily masculine society can want the exact same thing as a person from a collective or a feminine society, but just go about it in a completely different way. So the last arrow on the slide is something that is very, very important to Westerners as well, and that is the power dominance / power distance. And that is generally thought of as the degree to which people are comfortable either influencing upwards in society and the acceptance of kind of inequality in the distribution of power in society. So that can manifest itself in some very interesting ways. You usually see this sort of thing in the world of business, where in extremely hierarchical societies, a supervisor is expected to provide so much more vision, so much more for an employee, and an employee is expected to follow what the supervisor has done, what the vision the supervisor has laid out, the task the supervisor has laid out. In societies that don't function that way, there is the understanding, particularly in Western societies, that the all opinions are appreciated. If the person at the bottom end of the totem pole has a great idea, that idea should be expressed. And we have seen this in a clash of work cultures. Like I said, this is most usually manifested itself in the business professional environment, but can manifest itself in exercises as well in their and our expectations of other people's behavior, and how we expect other cultures to behave themselves, and how we expect other people in other cultures to pursue what they want. That having been said, before we move to the next slide, what I would like to do is I would like to put a caveat in there to insert another caveat in saying that when we represent these cultures and entities in exercises, it can be very easy to forget that no culture or society is a monolith. We tend to see the differences and the variances within our own society, but assume, or not necessarily assume, but not necessarily have an understanding of or an appreciation of the variances and the differences in other societies and other organizations. And I think that two things can happen when we do this. A, we miss out on a tremendous opportunity to reach out to those various aspects of society and various portions of cultures and other citizens of other countries, and B, what you can do is you can assume that just because one group of people feels this way in a society, the entire group of society is going to do this, or is going to feel a particular way about a particular policy or something like that. I guess the best example of that would be I've heard the tagline from if there's a takeaway from the Arab Spring, and I know that a lot of people hold their noses when they say that term, but I use it because everyone knows what we're talking about. One of the key takeaways was that we learned that we can no longer, and when I say I can mean dictators, I can mean the West, the street must be accounted for. Before, in a lot of relations, all that mattered was what the dictator or what the government or what the person at the top said. And so that, like I said, has been a takeaway from, at least with a lot of the subject matter experts that I've talked to have said that. So I think it's fun. I think it's fun to consider how different people in society do different things and how societies can take on overall characteristics, and you can approach them with these 5 dimensions, but how different people in society can feel differently. They can be within a spectrum closer to their countrymate or their citizen or fellow citizen, but still be, as far as those people are concerned, very different. It's been my experience that in working with people from all over the world, they say, although Americans see themselves as very different, they are more alike than they are different. So I offer that as a way, I offer that as a kind of a parting shot when considering the Big 5. When you think about how who you are impacts the products that you produce, one of the places you want to start is to look at these sorts of things, these 5 dimensions, as they affect your outlook and they affect pretty much everything. Next slide, please. This is a quick comparison about how the U.S. and several other cultures kind of stack up. Like I said, if you visit various websites online, you will quickly come to see this, and they will be replete with examples of how the practical application of what I'm talking about produces funny and, in some cases, tragic opportunities to misunderstand each other. Next slide, please. Narrative is many, many, many things to many, many, many people. Like other intangible concepts, this is slide 19 I'm on. A lot of these concepts that I have floating out here, kind of these little words I have, you can't really know what there's not a really formal definition of what they are. You only know that you don't have them when you see them not working. So it's very easy to define what they're not, and it's very easy to identify people that don't have them. My personal favorite is social capital, which is the ability, I guess, to get things done. So it is influence, affinity, it's all of those things, or as various cousins of mine or their sons and daughters would say, the equivalent on the street is cred, which is credibility, pull, influence, likability, all of these things. Like I said, they're hard to define. The best way I've heard them explained is these are some of these things, these understandings and these realizations, or the importance of these things, come in life gradually all at once. Once you figure out that you have no influence, or once you see a situation through a particular lens, a different narrative lens, you then can't figure out how you looked at it that way before, or how you didn't see it that way before. So narrative is something that is becoming more and more important as various organizations, particularly the U.S., I understand the U.S. military has several people that now are working to control the narrative, as it is a very important arm in issue advancement and issue definition. So, and policy recommendations as well. That's a very significant piece of this. It is usually, to borrow from its marketing cousin, public relations, or its military cousin, strategic communications. It looks like many different things, and it's all kind of after this whole thing. What is the story you are trying to tell? With the understanding that if you are not telling your story, someone else is. That's how this sort of thing manifests itself. It's been my experience in exercises. It is something that I have found is very difficult to get people to look at and to basically dive down into. With respect to exercises, I have found that people always acknowledge that the importance of having a strategic communications plan to control the narrative, but they very rarely go beyond what that plan, they very rarely delve into what that plan should look like. This is once again in educational activities. And I find that getting the narrative wrong, or getting a particular group of people's narrative wrong, as well as getting what motivates them incorrect, or not picking out those key events in a narrative, almost pretty much guarantees that you're going to get any sort of policy recommendation less right as well. So with that, we will move to the next slide, and this is slide 20. It's very simply memory. It's a very simple concept, but in a way it's not. What happened? Why did it happen? Who did what to whom? These experiences, they vary by person. It's been my experience, and they can even vary within the same person. You can see one person, or you can see an organization or a country act one way in one particular area and act another way in another particular area. And I think the thing that we often forget, and by we, I mean we in the U.S. when it comes to, and I've seen this manifest itself in exercises, we forget how important these sorts of things are, and we forget the divisions that happen in our own society when it comes to memory. I once had an undergraduate teacher who said, and the statement really resonated, I could drive 100 miles south of D.C. and get in a fight this afternoon as to what happened between the years 1861 and 1865. And I think that we make a grave mistake as gamers when we create products or facilitate exercises that don't try to get at those key events that are lodged in a particular group's memory, that form the basis of their narrative, that will determine what they're going to go after, because I think that a lot of these sorts of things are wrapped up in very deeply, it's been my experience, wrapped up and very deeply buried in how, where in people's minds, in their collective memories, in their national memories, in their existence. So with that having been said, I'm going to move into very quickly now where to find this stuff, where to find indicators of narrative and how to get at it. Next slide, please. I have had incredible luck with pop culture. And I mean literally popular culture. The more something resonates with an entire group of people who are, by their very nature, aren't a monolith, the better off you are reading that book, listening to that song, because it really captures an essence of the people. Some examples of that, I have Hegel right here because, I just have an affinity for philosophy, but he coined that term, the kind of the cultural zeitgeist. And if you can tap into that, if you can look for a book, or if you can look for a song or something like that that illustrates what is going on, that captures the mood, that's one thing that artists do. They create products that speak to or capture or illustrate the significant cultural components of the day. It is impossible to think about what happened in the 90s in the United States if you were a 20-something and not have the show Friends resonate in your life, depending on what type of 20-something you were. If you were one 20-something, Friends resonated. If you were another 20-something, the group above them, NWA, resonated. The person above him, above that group, is El General, who is a Tunisian rapper who is widely credited with kind of providing the lyrics of the Arab Spring. It has, and when I was into, I guess, my third game on Yemen and that region, and came across his lyrics, and if you read them, they almost read like State Department talking points. They talk about corruption, unemployment, poverty, and it singled out various leaders in Tunisia directly. And it's one of those things where if you're looking for if you suddenly have in society an explosion of a particular sentiment or a particular thought, it's been there all along. People just don't look for it, and they just don't know where to look for it, and they just don't know where to see it. I have used books where possible. When I was facilitating an exercise on Mexico, I asked an ambassador if there was one thing that could get me to the mindset of a Mexican. If there was one thing, what would it be? And he recommended The Labyrinth of Solitude, and I found it extremely helpful. Likewise, one of the things that I have avoided in my cultural studies has been the event that happened in the United States between 1861 and 1865. And when I came to DOD and I asked people what I should read, were there books that talked about this? This is The Killer Angels is the book that was recommended more times than not. So I'm not saying you don't always have the time to read a particular book or something like that. Music works very well because it also tends to reach more people, because more people listen to music than read. It's been my experience. But these are ways to get at something. If all of a particular group of people like something, whatever it is, speaks very basically to something about that group of people. And plus, it's been my experience, it's kind of a fun way to get at this as well, because you're not just reading dusty old journals. Next slide, please. The more traditional way of going about this is in disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, history, international relations journals, cross-cultural studies. I have found that red teaming, the language surrounding red teaming, which is most usually how these alternative perspectives come into exercises. The Red Team University has put out some really good stuff. TRADOC has some things, Quantico Marine Base. I also like journals and subject matter experts, best practices coming out of theater, courses and curricula, and as I mentioned earlier, pop culture works very well also. I also like to talk to people doing it. What is in place at the operational level in theater, and that can be anywhere or anything. Because one thing I've definitely learned is that at least history, which is where I often go first, is often it captures a particular strata of society, which isn't necessarily reflective of all of society, and that is, at least as far as when you're representing alternative perspectives and when it comes to geographic perspectives, and by that I mean countries or regions. I've also found this organizationally in that to run an organization, you have a different understanding of that organization than if you're doing the work. So if you run the thing as opposed to do the thing, you get a vastly different perspective. So that's why you really want to try and hit as many different types of sources. And usually when people do this, they hit different types of sources along a political spectrum or along an ideological spectrum. You want to try and get as varied a sources as you possibly can. Not necessarily saying that you'll get everything that you need to know, but you'll increase the likelihood that you've better represented motivations and intent. Next slide. We're nearing the end of the talk, and I wanted to offer 3 concepts which I found recur over and over and over in every exercise I've ever done. First, I want to say the exercises that I've done, I jokingly say to my colleagues, I game the done to. I don't game the doers, and I mean that in historical purposes. I game Africa, the Middle East, that sort of thing. And when I've talked to people from those regions, I had a conversation with a brigadier general, an African general, and one of the things that he told me is that one of the things that Americans don't understand about fighting is that when Americans fight, it's us versus, pun intended, us versus them. The group of people is often outside of their borders, and they are different. And that allows people to think about conflict in a particular way. And he did recognize that this is changing, but he finds this fascinating. And once he said it, I found it fascinating. And whereas he said when others fight, they often fight us. They often fight within. They often fight within their geographic borders. They often fight within their own. They're fighting over an identity that has been historically established, and you fight very differently when you do that. And I know that there are entire schools of thought dedicated to how to do that, but I just think it's one of those things that when I go to sit down to do an exercise, I often have to think about that. What is the us versus the them, and how does that manifest itself in this particular exercise? I wanted to revisit memory because every subject matter expert I've ever talked to always says, well, the thing that Americans don't understand is people from insert country here have oral traditions that allows them to carry with them the last 1,000 years of their group of people or their geographic region or their country. And regardless of where I go, and by go, I mean regardless of where I end up doing an exercise, at least one subject matter expert has always said that to me, and I find that very fascinating, to the point where I've almost even come up with a Mad Lib where I know I'm deeper into my research when I hit the sentence. To understand modern day insert country here, you have to go back to or understand what insert colonial power here did in insert year here. And once I hit that sentence, I know I'm well along in my research, and I know that I'm well along in I'm moving in the right direction. The other thing about memory with oral traditions is that things don't cycle out of your cultural DNA. You find this in that people can talk about something that happened 1,500 years ago like it happened last Saturday night. And that is huge. That is something that Americans, since we're such a young country, by and large just don't take into account. I'm reminded of that old joke that when I think it was Mao was asked about the French Revolution, he said it's too early to tell. So it is one of those things that it just doesn't. We don't understand that, and we have to work so hard to bring that piece in to these perspectives, as well as to better understand people's motivations. Because if you get it wrong, that's everything. Finally, a last bit I would like to talk about with the additional concept is time. And that is most Americans deal in political cycles, and the rest of the world does not. Next slide.
Rock the cans bar.
All right, we're going to very quickly run through traditional methods, other options of how we can do this, and a wee bit of caution. The traditional methods are in color codings on the screen, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, and they basically talk about the forces within an exercise and how they're represented color-wise. Next slide. Another way to bring in these alternative perspectives is in how you define the scenario, obviously. Read-aheads, these are some of the products, participant guides. One of the things I do with a game that we do, a repetitive game that we do, and I know that not everybody does that, is we really have gotten a chance to hone what type of person fits in what type of role. Because within any exercise, there are certain people for whom if they do not show up with the goods, if that isn't a strong personality, the exercise is a different exercise. As well as you can include this sort of thing into professional cultures. Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with the Mars-Venus State Defense Treatise. If not, please go online. It's an interesting way to it's an interesting 101 way to understand the challenge of interagency work. I often coach participants. You can speak to them very directly about how you want them to think about something. And when I say coach, I mean when we talk about gaming or an exercise, I'm not necessarily saying specifically how to move through the exercise. And we also coach facilitators, too, to try and get a sense of who they are and how they're going to bring what they're going to bring to the exercise so that we can reduce the likelihood of their stuff getting in the way of the exercise. Next page. These are the challenges I have found. I don't necessarily have a problem with rational actor theory. It's just that it triggers a Western linear thinking lore of science, which leads you to believe that if there is a formula, if there is a recipe, then the result has to be better. I'm not necessarily saying that's not the case, but it's very easy to get sucked into that. Productivity and the need to get things done, it can be tricky because real strong drivers want things done, and you are often talking about things for which there aren't any easy answers. Objectivity is the same thing. That's generally, it is what it is. The objectivity isn't necessarily, I don't personally think it exists, but that's another conversation. But it really does tend to get in the way if you've got people that lean towards and believe in objectivity, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be very difficult to bring in those other perspectives. If you're playing a long exercise, or if from a policy standpoint you're working with you're developing an exercise for a closed group, marginalization works as a barrier to inclusion because the person that's marginalized is probably the person that's different, which is probably bringing the alternative perspective. So by the time their point is needed, they have given up or they are no longer involved and no longer engaged. The final one is assumptions, and as the old saying goes, show me your assumptions and I'll show you your solution to a problem. So opportunities for inclusion, quite simply, to borrow a medical term, the protein cloak. I started this. My protein cloak when starting this was red teaming. I wanted to get information about how that worked and how the military did that. That has been extremely helpful and can be extremely helpful in talking to higher-ups and talking to people about trying to include different perspectives, because the case made for joint and the case made for diversity and the case made for understanding your enemy is found in that language. Lastly, I would like to say use everything you have. Bring all of your different selves to an exercise. If you can, in facilitating an exercise, I can fall on the fact that I am female and point out, okay, if we were having this discussion 150 years ago, I wouldn't be leading it because the thoughts about who I am and what my capabilities are have changed. I do that to illustrate, I use that sort of thing very sparingly. I do that sort of thing to illustrate how facts change all the time. And I put assumptions down both on challenges as well as opportunities because of the very nature of them. And finally, last page, on 28, I offer a wee bit of caution because when you begin this process, beware. Sometimes when you do it, you're the bull. Sometimes you're the matador, and sometimes you're the flag. So, and that can change at any moment. So, thus, I conclude my discussion. And if there is time, questions.
Deirdre, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about. There's always some organizational resistance to bringing in alternative perspectives because it's different. But moreover, occasionally I've seen times where I have to convince people that they're relevant. And I think you covered some of that really ably in your why slide, but I was wondering if there were particular things you had found helpful in trying to convince, particularly when as gamers we're more of a client consultant relationship, convincing the client that this really is what's best for them.
Sure. First and foremost, I want to say that there have been, for as many times where I've had success, there have been many times where I haven't had success. And when I say success, I mean being able to do this after having been given the green light from the client. What I've done every so often, and I use this very sparingly, I will, if I don't get success or I can't bring the client to where I need to be, I will prepare the products differently, so that the perspective that I think needs to be there should be represented, or it can get into how a perspective particularly needs to be there. So that's one thing where I'll take license as game author and fall on my sword that way. The other things that I have done is and this has led to more yeses than nos. As I have mentioned, I try to say I am just trying to replicate the environment in which people will have to make decisions later. While I cannot faithfully represent down to the minutia what people will have to consider, I can represent to the best of my ability the types of things people will have to consider. And I try and draw it back to the specific, because generally if a person has a problem with the very specific thing that I'm trying to include in an exercise, they usually don't have a problem with the reason why I'm trying to do it.
This is Doug Samuelson. Not a question, but a comment. I've found in some games, depending on the scenario, in particular the sort of game that would be a typical USSR thing, having some people play against type can be very informative. I used to try to get, this was back in the not too long after Vietnam era, I'd try to get some peaceniks to play the blue team and some red-blooded American patriots to play the red team, and we would all observe with some amusement and some enlightenment how fast the blue team started sounding like the U.S. and the red team started sounding like the Soviets, because the scenario drove them in that direction. We learned a lot about the scenario that way.
Yes, I have. I wish we had more opportunity to create create situations like that here. We are a victim often of time. And by that I mean we have a particular class time or something like that allotted for us. And we also have the challenge of if the person playing against type will go with. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But when they do, I agree, I think it's great, and it's really fascinating because it really does illustrate how people can change based on their circumstances.
Yeah, Paul Block out of Boeing, one of the things I did in the 90s when we had something called the Revolution Military Affairs Wargaming going was to bring students from the Naval Postgraduate School, where I was at that time, into the Revolutionary Games, because it brought a different perspective. It brought colonels and captains, Navy captains in. They had one perspective. You brought lieutenants and lieutenant commanders and majors in, an entirely different perspective on the changes in technology and the changes in strategic development. Could you make any comment about, I didn't see anything in your thing about age or seniority of participants as far as, well, I guess you did talk about that, but as far as introducing them into the game.
We tend to, the exercises that we're doing now, they are educational, and as they support courses, we have who we have, and when you bring up the question of age, could you restate that question, please? Because I wonder, I'm hearing several different questions, and I want to make sure I understand you.
I guess the idea of seniority, you addressed it in the sense of seniority, where the JOs will say, keep quiet. What we tried to do at that time was encourage the JOs. We brought teams from postgraduate school to NDU to participate in these Revolution Military Affairs games, with the intent of trying to get a younger perspective into the game. And I guess if you're teaching at NDU there, of course you're stuck with your population. But the idea, if you're looking for different ideas for employment of forces, would you want to bring in a younger group, because there are different attitudes towards technology these days?
Yeah, I have found particularly, like you said, around technology. That's a challenge with any exercise that involves technology, and I don't do that many of them in which technology plays a large role. And by that I mean execution, because when I say because, I mean it can play a large role and can be a challenge, because technology, it means different things to different people that happen to be in different stages of their lives. And it can be very hard, like you said, to get people to understand something. It's like, no, this actually is a big deal. And one of the things that we have tried to do, because we haven't been very successful in bringing people in, and I don't even know to the extent that we've tried it. One of the things that we have tried to do is to try to show the ability for these people who can master technology and who understand and appreciate these things, the advantage that they have in controlling the alternative spaces in an area. I think that was one thing that the Arab Spring talks that we've had here at the university have done very, very well, is that they have illustrated the importance of and the ability of technology to mobilize the populace to kind of move things along in a way that they didn't before. And how they can impact that sort of thing. But no, I wish we had the opportunity to do what you said. I will definitely bring that up and see how far it gets. But we haven't done it to this point. At least not to...
It's sort of a follow-on. Iran, presumably, did some stuff up at APU or APL a few years back on non-standard warfare. And the thought was that Iran has a whole culture of young people, basically communicating on their telephones and their iPads and things like that, completely below the radar of the religious police. And I just wonder, have you guys done anything about looking at like that sort of how you address that kind of a society?
The way that we have put that sort of thing into exercises is my colleague Ellie, whom you're all familiar with, does an exercise that does take into account kind of popular opinion and that sort of thing. And we have in exercises that I've done, particularly, I know the same sort of thing happens in Nigeria. Nigerians absolutely adore technology. So anytime you're doing an exercise on Nigeria, you have to account for technology as well. And we use that as a way of a conduit of ideas. And you can do that we do that in placement in products usually, game materials, because we have, like I said, we don't do the variety of exercises that we used to, and we're still kind of almost figuring out what that looks like and what our how our new mission will inform the exercises that we do. But as that has been changing, one of the things that we have done is to look at doing as much as we can in product placement, in the creation of materials and things like that.
Great.
I think we've got time for one more question if anybody has an additional one.
This is Doug Samuelson again. Can you say a little bit more about scenario design? And by way of background to that question, one of the games I was involved in a few years ago at Giado, we were looking at, again, one of the fluid in-country situations. An election was about to take place. We had this diabolical red player. This is why we had this diabolical red player. Be anybody you want. Figure out how you would screw this up. And the red player came up with the idea of being a crime lord who wanted no government to form and realized that any government that did form would be by coalition. And he didn't have a lot of power. He had to be a little careful about how he operated. So what he did was start assassinating the intermediaries who were working with the leading politicians to make coalition. I think the scenario there that drove the train, the scenario and the creativity of that red player. How do you make these things happen more often? I have some thoughts on that.
Well, what I've tried to do is I reach out to, the challenge is a lot of times here, we can't get the people that we want because a lot of times it, at least for policy exercises, it's a clearance issue, but we don't necessarily have that problem here. It's a scheduling or whatever. What I try to do is if we can't bring that person in, we try to bring that person's brain in to the extent that we can. We work very, very closely with as many different subject matter experts as we possibly can. And I guess in one instance, that us being that academic, coming from that academic background, allows for that in a way that it doesn't in other environments. I have found that if you I always ask certain kind of my core questions, but my first question that I always ask any subject matter expert is, what's going on in your region that I'm not reading about in coverage, wherever that coverage may be, and that tends to get at those sorts of things, that creativity piece that I myself wouldn't even necessarily come up with, because the other problem with that but another thing about my approach is I do all different types of games. So being a generalist, you're starting a bit further behind or a bit further upstream. Whereas if you have a certain area that you are familiar with, you can start a bit downstream and can know to ask those questions. What I do is I do as much research as I possibly can, and then I try also to depend very heavily on the creativity of subject matter experts. So that's one thing I look for in a subject matter expert, is someone that is willing to go with that, to try and have that person in the queue. And I spend a lot of time trying to determine who those people are to be able to reach out to them, because it's been my experience I don't necessarily have enough time to find that person after the exercise after the research process has started. So I, to the extent that I can, I cultivate those sorts of sources on downtime.
Well, great. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I particularly want to thank Deirdre for what I think was an incredibly valuable presentation. The recording of this lecture will be posted online, as the previous lectures have been, on our YouTube page, which is CASL's Lectures on Gaming, so you can find our channel there. They're also usually available via our website. However, we've been having some technical difficulties. So for right now, I'd point you towards the YouTube channel. And thank you again, and have a great day.